Good evening, everyone. I'm Chrissy Kelly, the founder of Absent, and welcome tonight to the 10th in our Tuesday evening webinar series. It's lovely to be here again, and I know that many of you are really enjoying this. So I hope you are settling in for an amazing evening tonight. We have got with us Duika Burges Watson, who is a lecturer at the University of Newcastle, and she is the founder of the Altered Eating Network. Duika will speak to us about her work and how what she does is actually very relevant to what we're trying to do for you. I'm also joined tonight by Vincent Deary of Northumbria University, and Vincent is a writer and researcher and is in clinical practice as well. And finally, I'm joined by Sheri Taylor, who I've never met until this evening. So it's really nice to meet you, Sheri. I know you'll be a great addition this evening. Sheri is, she is a dietitian and she is director of specialist nutrition rehab. And she helps people who have had brain injuries redevelop a relationship with food. So without further ado, I think what I'd like to do now is turn it over to Duika, who is going to show us a couple of pretty pictures in her background. And
I'll give you another one.
Oh, there's another one. So off you go, Duika.
Okay, so it's just wonderful to be here, and been doing a lot of work recently with Chrissy and with the Facebook group. And I think the way that we have worked, we work a lot with people with altered eating difficulties in different conditions. We weren't expecting COVID-19 to be one of them, but we've been working for about 10 years, first of all with head and neck cancer survivors, and then increasingly we've got students working on topics like Sjogren's syndrome, acquired brain injury, autism, all sorts of different areas. And in the work that we've been doing, we recognised that the best way that we could do research was to talk to patients and work with them to develop some of the skills that we've come up with and ways of coping. So so we're going to go through what I hope is a sort of hopeful range of different techniques and skills and ideas for you that might help you a little bit in navigating your way through an altered eating difficulty. And I've got this water up behind me because I think one of the places I think it's really important to start is to think about the fact that it's really difficult to tell people about what's happening for you. You can't see it on somebody's body, on the outside of their body. It's very difficult to say, I've got an altered eating difficulty, for anybody else to understand what it's like to be in your skin with that. And I was thinking about how you might explain that complexity by thinking about water, which seems so fundamental to eating. So if you've got anosmia and you can't smell anything, what's behind me might look like water, but I've had a client who had head and neck cancer who accidentally drank some methylated spirits because he didn't realise that it was water. If you have parosmia, what's behind me might look like water, but it could taste and smell like a cesspit that's just unbearable. And if you have phantosmia, the water is kind of irrelevant. Everything can smell completely crazy and it's got nothing to do with the aromas that are coming in. So what I thought would be quite interesting to do would be to start with you, Vincent, to talk about that idea of storying, which I think is so important for people.
Yeah, so first of all, welcome everybody. And I'm Vincent, I'm a health psychologist. Also, I work clinically in a fatigue clinic. So I work a lot with people who, whatever the reason, have got chronic disabling fatigue. Some of the people I see are head and neck cancer survivors or cancer survivors in general. Some have got autoimmune conditions like Sjogren's syndrome. And what they all share is the fact that their disability is invisible. So the people sitting in the chair across from me, they look completely fine. And you wouldn't think that would be a big problem, but it's a really big part of the clinical work that we do together. So they talk a lot about people around them not getting it, not understanding. So sticking with fatigue for the moment. So you look absolutely fine. So why can't you come out to dinner tonight? You could do that thing yesterday. Why can't you do it again today? And what we've begun to talk about in the research around this is storyability. When you've got a complex condition that is not easily understood by other people, it's really difficult to explain it. And then that work of explaining it, that accounting for yourself, becomes part of the work of having the condition. It's really exhausting when you're continually having to justify and explain yourself. So to give you a brief academic sidebar, they talk about 3 different kinds of illness narratives. So there's a simple one that we've all had if we get something like a cold, and it's called a restitution narrative, or kind of there and back again. You get the cold, you feel crap for a bit, you take some paracetamol, you get back to normal. So you're kind of restored back to normality. So that's the simplest one to story. There's kind of available narratives about that. The second one is what they call a restitution narrative. So we see that a lot, for instance, in cancer survivors. They're never going to get back to normal. So like the people we work with head and neck cancer, they've got permanently altered swallowing, taste and smell, but eventually they learn to live with it. They make meaning out of it. They get acceptance from themselves and from other people around it. So it's almost like a quest. You're never going to go back to where you were, but you manage to make meaning. And I think equally importantly, the medical profession you deal with, they get it as well. So there's available discourses that help you understand what's happening to you. The third narrative, and the one that's really problematic, and the one I think may apply to a lot of people we're talking to tonight, is what they call a chaos narrative. So it's where you can't make any sense of your condition. It keeps changing. There's no predictability about it. People around you don't get it. People around, even medics who you go to for help, they're going, there's nothing we can do about it. And what emerges really clearly from the research is with that kind of chaos narrative, that inability to story it, it makes it, whatever you're suffering from, much more disabling, much more debilitating. So I think it's a concept that can help, because what we get people to do in clinic is focus on the people that get it. What account can you give to people who get your condition? And then can you use the account of the people who get it to either do a shorthand version, or are there some people who you don't need to explain things to? So thinking about that concept of who gets it and who doesn't, and what kind of work you might need to do around that. Hopefully that might be a useful concept.
Yeah, that's really interesting, Vincent. You and I have spoken about storying last time we had a Zoom to discuss our evening tonight.
Indeed.
And that was the first time I had heard it presented that way. And for my own story has had a couple of forms. And I think that it's important for people to realize that they may start with a chaos storyline that then becomes more of a quest, let's say a quest for some kind of well-being again. And obviously in this setting, we're talking about well-being through food and kind of reestablishing our pleasure centers, you know, that so often are answered by the food kind of aspect of our lives. So I think that's really important one, and you will in time, everyone, no doubt hear more about this kind of chaotic storyline and how important it is for you to kind of keep that in your mind, so that when you're talking to other people in the Facebook group, that you know, everyone understands that. People understand that implicitly, but to hear it described that way is, I think, really important. Duika, can we talk a little bit about pleasure? And let's talk about wanting versus liking, and also what happens to the craving impulse when it comes to food. I'd like to talk about these sort of broader topics in the beginning, and then we can get in the second half of the hour, because we want to get through these things quickly. We're going to talk more about food, but in kind of general terms, let's talk about wanting versus liking, and what happens when you can no longer get the hit of pleasure that you might get from something that you craved.
Yeah, well, the research from neurology is showing that we have kind of one pleasure center in the human brain. They can actually map the human brain now, and when the pleasure center lights up, frequently it will light up from food, but it will also light up from other sort of what I would call higher order rewards, like reading or writing or doing exercise or intimacy. Other sorts of things can give you pleasure other than food. So I think one of the things to remember when you have lost the pleasure of food is that you need to keep up your quotient of other pleasures, because we know that pleasure is really important to well-being. So that's one thing to think about in relation to pleasure. The other thing about pleasure when it comes to food is that normally the way that the brain works is that when we want something, we also tend to like it. That's normally the way that works. But I think a lot of people are probably experiencing at the moment that when you have lost the sense of smell in particular, you start craving and sometimes even binge eating other types of foods because you just can't get that satisfaction and pleasure that makes you feel like you've had a proper meal. So it's quite useful. And we have a student who's been working on weight cycling, people who go yo-yo dieting. So they'll eat lots and fall off the wagon and eat lots and fall off the wagon. And what we found with them is that they find it really helpful to think about the difference of wanting something and liking something. So for example, I think about, for me, I don't really eat McDonald's hamburgers, but let's say, for example, I'm kind of like craving a McDonald's hamburger. I'm craving all that fat and salt and so forth. When I actually eat the McDonald's hamburger, I might not enjoy it quite as much as I was expecting to. So by making that distinction between wanting and liking, it makes it a little bit easier to resist the temptation to have those very highly palatable, sugary, fatty, salty foods that seem to be something that people are coping with quite a bit at the moment. So I think that can be quite helpful.
And I think it's also helpful, Deika, to think about the difference between being full and being satisfied. Because people sometimes don't realize there's a difference. So being full is your tummy being sort of stretched out and those signals, you know, going to your brain. And you can be full from drinking a liter of water, you can be full from drinking a whole bunch of iceberg lettuce, but most of us know that even if you try and trick yourself into filling yourself up with those foods, sometimes you still have the craving for more, even though your tummy's full.
Yeah.
And what's different is that the satisfaction comes a lot from sort of the psychological element, the understanding the look of the food, the smell of the food, the taste of the food, all of those sensory elements are a huge fundamental part of being satisfied with the food that you're eating. So if you're not satisfied because of a change in your sense of smell or for some other reason, then it's quite normal to want to keep eating to kind of satisfy those parts of your brain. So we're going to be talking a little bit later in terms of compensation strategies. So if your sense of smell has changed, what can you do instead? How can you still get a maximum satisfaction from your food to kind of turn off those parts of your brain that keep wanting to eat and eat?
Right. Can I just jump in and say, I forgot to mention, give you some housekeeping notes before we started. We do have a Q&A feed here. So if you'd like to ask a question of the panelists, please use the Q&A and we will see how many we can get around to answering. I also have a poll that I will put up in a little bit, but I'm just going to make sure that we don't get a few more stragglers coming in. We have one comment already from Sina who says, I keep wanting to eat my favorite ice cream, even though it's tasteless and unpleasant. I get angry and frustrated. So that's, that's a sad fact, and one that is, you know, a situation that's been experienced by many.
Yeah, and I think we're noticing a lot that people are finding it makes it really difficult to regulate their weight and health with anosmia and parosmia as well. So some people are finding it's almost impossible to eat anything at all because the smell can be overwhelming. Some people don't want to eat because they're not getting any flavour. And then some people are limited to what they can eat, so they're not getting the nutritional balance that they need. So it can be really frustrating if all you can experience in your mouth is the fatty, salty, sugary flavors, and you're just not getting that satisfaction, and it's not feeding you well either. So that really makes it challenging.
Stay tuned, Sina, because I'll be talking a little bit more in a few minutes about the sensory star and sort of compensation strategies. And if it's maybe the coldness or the iciness of the ice cream that's giving you the satisfaction, then perhaps there's other things that we can use, maybe ice in your drinks or frozen grapes or different things like that that would appeal to that part of your brain, you know, but be slightly more nutritious for you.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so I think we're sort of moving into it, really, aren't we? Knowing a little bit more about how the senses work. And we've kind of come up with this idea that we really need to become sensory detectives of our own experience, because when I've been reading the Facebook posts, what we realize is that everybody's experience is so different. Mm-hmm. And, you know, one person will say, oh, I used to like Coke and now I can only drink Pepsi. And the other person will say, oh, I used to like Pepsi and now I can only drink Coke. It's like, it feels like there's no logic to it. And to some extent, we can find bits of logic, but it's still very much an individual experience, because we all start with different preferences around food and we have different sensory systems. So I think one of the things that we're going to talk about, and I've got the sensory star to my right and the taste star to my right, which Sheri's going to talk about. And they, I think, can become a really useful part of what you might think of as a sensory toolkit. You become a detective of your own experience. And with this, you can move a little bit beyond trial and error and narrow the field a bit. Better understand why some things are working for you and some things aren't. And so that with a little bit of sleuthing, you can start to deduce the things that are going to work for you better than others. So should we start a little bit with talking about the sensory star and the taste star, Sheri? Because I found it really useful.
I was
Yeah,
just going I was just going to suggest very briefly kind of framing that whole notion in terms of what we talked about earlier, in terms of being curious. One of the things we noticed in our work with head and neck cancer survivors was it was a long journey. It goes back to that process of sense making, coming to terms with it. And the people who eventually reached an accommodation with food and a new relationship with food and pleasure were the people who persisted, who kept experimenting, who kept trying new things, who were willing to have things change from day to day and adjust accordingly. So I know it's a difficult shift, but shifting into that mode of curiosity about your own, because like Duika said, no two cases are the same. So effectively you have to become your own case manager in a way to deal with this. So I just thought putting that frame around the sensory star.
Yeah. Thank you, Vincent. That's really helpful. So the orange star that's behind Duika is the sensory star, and I really love using it because it's a beautiful sort of visual representation to help us understand how we derive joy and pleasure from food and eating. And it's not something that many of us give a whole lot of thought or attention to until there's a problem, but it's actually information that everyone would benefit from. So if you think of the sensory star, there's 5 points on the star, or you can just use your fingers to help remind you. So there's 5 basic senses. So there's the taste of the food, there's what the food looks like, there's what the food sounds like, there's the smell of the food, and then there's how it feels in your mouth. Okay, so those are the 5 kind of basic senses involved. So what's really helpful is if you understand each of those and the joy you're deriving from food, then you can, if you have an area that maybe your senses are not what you would like them to be, you can sort of compensate by kind of dialing up the other senses to get even more pleasure from your food. So if we focus on taste to start with, so taste refers specifically to the information transmitted from the taste buds on your tongue. So it refers only to sweet, sour, salty, bitter, and umami. And we're going to be talking a little bit more about each of those in a minute. But a lot of people, and perhaps Chrissy, you've already talked about this in one of your previous webinars, you know, but a lot of people get that term mixed up. They're like, oh, this food doesn't taste very good, but they're sort of mixing up pure taste with actually the flavor of the food, the texture and the smell and the taste combination. So it's important for everyone to think about, do you detect the basic tastes of your food? Do you detect sweet, sour, salty, bitter, and umami? Because if you do, that's a fantastic opportunity for you to kind of really dial up the elements in your food to get as much pleasure as possible from that.
But Sheri, can I just jump in here and say that, of course, with COVID-19, we've got lots of patients who have also lost true taste. And that is then a double challenge, you know,
it is a double
as well as chemesthesis. So, you know, they're not getting anything, not even chili or, you know.
So then that ties in nicely actually with the second point on the star then, which is what the food looks like, right? So maybe not something that most of us spend a lot of time and energy on at home, but if you go to a fancy Michelin star restaurant, you know how they can make the food look like beautiful works of art because they understand how important the visual appearance of food is to the pleasure experience. So if you maybe have a diminished sense of taste and a diminished sense of smell, then maybe you want to be focusing a bit more on the presentation of your food, the color combinations, the shapes, you know, the crockery that it's presented on, how you present the food. All of those things can really help give you a little bit more pleasure. The next point is the sound of the food, or what the hearing element, which sounds a bit peculiar, but can you imagine if you bit into a stalk of celery or an apple or a crisp and it didn't crunch? That would probably really drastically affect your experience of that food. So it applies both to the chewing element of the food, but also the sounds in the environment. So there's been some research around if you play the sound of bubbles when you're drinking champagne or fizzy water, that experience will be more bubbly than if you weren't listening to those sounds. Or I've been to restaurants where you listen to the sound of the ocean while eating seafood, and it makes your seafood taste more salty than if you don't listen to those sounds. It's really quite fascinating how that works. So again, that's another area that maybe people could focus on if they're struggling with some of the other senses. The next one would be the smell of the food, and I understand that's where most people have their challenges at the minute. And as many of you are aware, that the taste what tells you something is sweet, but whether that sweetness is from a strawberry or a peach is actually down predominantly to your sense of smell. So, but even if you have no sense of smell, or it's a distorted sense of smell, you can focus on the other 5 elements of the star to kind of dial up your enjoyment of the food that you're eating. And then finally, and probably most importantly from a compensation strategy, would be the feel of the food in your mouth. So, and there's sort of 5 different elements there that you can focus on. And this is linked to, there's a separate nerve on your tongue called the trigeminal nerve. And even if you have no sense of taste and no sense of smell, sometimes, not always, as Christy was saying, but sometimes people still get the trigeminal elements. And that's often what we use as much as possible to sort of, as a compensation strategy to help people get more pleasure. So there's 5 things that kind of stimulate the trigeminal nerve. One would be the texture of the food. So do you have food with multiple different textures in every bite, or do you have everything that's sort of the same texture? Obviously, more texture variety is more interesting to the brain. So we try and enhance that as much as possible if your swallowing is okay. The next would be temperature. So as Sina was saying, you know, sometimes really, really cold food like ice cream or ice chips or those kinds of things give a lot more pleasure, or really, really hot food like soup or hot chocolate. Or sometimes contrast in temperature, like really cold yogurt with really hot curry, and that contrast between the two is sometimes very pleasurable for people. Next would be anything that makes your tongue tingle. So whether it's horseradish, hot sauce, hot mustard, wasabi root, anything like that, sometimes in the absence of smell and sometimes taste, that burning, tingling sensation gives people a lot of pleasure. Next would be astringency. So if you've ever drank a really dry white wine, you know how it kind of dries your tongue out. Some people find that quite pleasurable, and you can get that from rhubarb or black grapes, for example. And then finally, carbonation would be the other one. So the bubbles. So sometimes people would rather have fizzy or sparkling water or soda water as opposed to still water, for example. Yeah. And then you can kind of mix and match, add ice to your fizzy water, for example, and you get the double whammy of the temperature and the bubbles, for example.
It's interesting. Sina has said, I'm sorry, but I'm not going to spend money in a restaurant for food that I can't taste or smell. Very unpleasant to watch others enjoying their food. Yeah. Now, that's interesting because what what she's not participating in is the pleasurable social experience of being together with people that she knows and presumably likes, and to want to enjoy the moment of kind of communal, doing something together. And I know a lot of people talk about this, that they don't want to go out and eat with other people.
Yeah.
But I wonder if there's not a way around that, because of course, to get, you know, the human relationship part of the social experience of eating is of course very important. And I know that in the beginning, so I had, for those of you who don't know, also had profound smell loss 8 years ago. And in the beginning, it was very difficult for me to go out to restaurants because I was very focused on my own disappointment in the food experience. But then I reached a point where I then began to love the experience of going into a restaurant and, you know, just taking in the scene and the soundscape and the fact that, you know, the table might be beautiful, or you know, the glassware would sparkle, or, you know, whatever the many things, the many small things that go into a restaurant experience became very pleasurable in themselves.
Yeah, and I think we found that very much with the head and neck cancer survivors that we were working with. Some of them had got to the point where they were getting no pleasure from food whatsoever. There was just nothing we could do. And so we had a couple of really good stories actually that demonstrate how they sort of reframed that in their own heads to think about the other things that gave them pleasure. So I'm thinking here, Vincent, about Val, who was fed almost entirely through a peg directly into the stomach. So she had very few opportunities to eat and enjoy the pleasure of food because most of her food was going into her stomach. But what she realized was that she loved walking on mountains. And we got this fantastic photo of her sitting on the top of the Yorkshire Dales, the Skiddaw Mountain in the Yorkshire Dales, having just spent 10 minutes feeding herself. And with that, she was able to then, you know, really enjoy the walking. So sometimes if the pleasure is really gone, it's really hard to compensate with food experiences, and you need to find something else to give you pleasure.
Yeah, absolutely. I just noticed that another comment that I think is Lena saying that she'll actually ask her friends to describe the taste of food, so it's another way of participating.
Yeah.
One of the words that I learned doing this research that's really helped me think about this is commensality. Yeah. And commensality is what happens. It happens all the time. You don't notice it until it's disrupted. But if you meet a friend, you make them a cup of tea, you go out for dinner, you meet in the pub, food and drink and sharing it is such a fundamental part of the social glue. And it's not until that's disrupted you realize how absolutely crucial that is to sociability, to pleasure, to well-being. And so, like Duika was saying, we saw a range of compensatory strategies in that. Some people just, it almost had like become a dry well. It just wasn't going to give them any water, any pleasure anymore. So they decided to walk away and find pleasure in other sociable activities, but recognizing that they needed the social, but they had to get it elsewhere was really important.
Right.
Whereas what we're seeing from Lena, for instance, and from what you were saying, Chrissy, is you still find a way of being in the food space and participating in it differently. And between those extremes, or between those two strategies, there's going to be a range of things that you can try. And it comes back to that not giving up on the quest, as it were.
I've heard of people taking to restaurant like a little toolkit kind of thing with bacon bits, hot sauce, different things that they need to use to kind of jazz up whatever food that they're having at whatever restaurant they happen to be at.
Yeah.
That's another option maybe.
Believe it or not, we're halfway through right now. So I'm going to put up the poll. So if any of you would like to take a couple of minutes to fill in our poll, that would be great. You will find it in the bottom bar there in the middle. It just says it says polling. So if you click on that, you can answer 5 quick questions for us. and that would be very helpful. At the end of the evening, we'll be interested in hearing what you have to say about that. Right, while you are doing that, I'm going to read, oh gosh, we've got a couple of more comments here. We have someone who has written, without my sense of smell, I miss the experimenting with cooking because I cannot taste test it. However, I now find enjoyment in following recipes that I know were created by those with a good sense of smell. I feel more at ease knowing that my family will enjoy the food. And that is very true. And another thing I'd like to add, for people who have parosmia and are really struggling to get food onto the table for their families, I think that the use of cookery books is a very important way of thinking about food and planning food, but not being exposed to the smell of food. So if you think to yourself, oh, I don't know what to eat, everything makes me sick, go to a favorite cookbook, find a recipe that you know, make a list of ingredients, and if you are in a situation where you really you do need to provide food, that can be a good way around that.
That's nice.
Chrissy, apparently the poll is not showing.
Oh dear, that's no good.
No.
Launch poll, I didn't press the all-important launch poll button. So sorry, everybody. I'll go back to questions now. Amanda says, I developed a burning mouth and tongue when the parosmia started. How would you suggest I deal with that, and is it common? Burning mouth, I think, is relatively common in COVID-19 and in Sjogren's, Vincent, I think. Is that right?
Absolutely, yes.
And do you have tips on dealing with that?
From the top of my head, I'm going to be quoting Helen Cartner, whose PhD research is in Sjogren's, and she has done some absolutely beautiful patient-led work where for the last 2 years she's been getting people together around food and they've been experimenting with it. And I'm afraid it's a boring old answer, no one size fits all. So some people were going for bland coating food, so we experimented with different textures of mashed potatoes. Other people had become very sensitive to things that didn't used to trigger stuff. We experimented with texture. So Sam, our incredible cook, he made some cheese dips out of solid cheese, and people who couldn't eat solid cheese because they got a burning sensation could eat the cheese dip, and one of them had this cheese epiphany in the middle of this research that was just a joy to be part of. So that's my experience from that bit, is experimenting with it and seeing what kind of dampens it down, or seeing if you can
And I would think, to add to that, Vincent, maybe, many of those trigeminal stimulators that I was speaking about earlier that can sometimes be helpful for people that have a diminished sense of taste and smell. Obviously, in the case of burning mouth syndrome, perhaps you want to stay away from those because those actually might trigger some of your symptoms and make them worse. So again, it's being quite strategic, being aware of what works for you, and then being strategic about what you need to dial up and what you need to dial down to get as much pleasure as possible.
Yeah.
The other thing I'd add to that, and I've put it down on my little cheat sheet here, is experiment with palate cleansers. So if you can find something that you can clear your mouth with when you are doing any kind of experimenting with food. Several people have suggested to me that they find sour tastes particularly good. Things like olives, lemon juice, or lemon rind, or citrus sorbet can be quite helpful. But again, no one size fits all. So lemon can work for a little while for one person and then not, or it may work for one person all the time. So there's a bit of experimenting with your palate cleansers as well. Mint is sometimes good for people. Water can even be good. Cinnamon, bay leaf, rosemary, cucumber, all sorts of different things that you might be able to cleanse your palate with when you're experimenting with foods that you're not quite sure if it's going to work or not.
Yeah, and of course, let's not forget just simple kind of, breath mints, cough sweets. For people who really do respond well to cinnamon, and that does seem to be a recurring theme for people who have parosmia, that cinnamon is palatable. There are cinnamon sweets, so I'd recommend you try those. That might help.
Did you find, Chrissy, that water was something that was okay for you?
I never found it disgusting. but I did find that I was suddenly sensitive to certain notes in the water, in tap water.
Mm-hmm.
And you know, one of the things I think is funny about parosmia is that unlike hyposmia, which is just a reduced sense of smell, which is undistorted,
Mm-hmm.
for many people, when parosmia comes, it comes in way out of proportion. Some of the smell messages that you get are incredibly intense,
Mm-hmm.
and so it makes it can make something insignificant seem incredibly overwhelming.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I was very sensitive to cucumber in the beginning, and I remember walking into a room that had a large room that had some water pitchers that had ribbons of cucumber peel in them to make them look attractive. And I walked in the room and I could smell the cucumber just from there.
Mm.
So there does seem to be some kind of unusual sensitivity to some of these off odors.
And one of the difficulties of this is that a lot of the off odors, like the sulfurous compounds and those sorts of things, are the most potent, as Jane Parker was saying in one of your other webinars. The level of potency can mean that they can be in incredibly minute quantities, but you experience them very, very powerfully. One of the things I was going to say for those people who are suffering with not being able to cope with water, one of the things that you can do is get a really good water filter, because parosmia is triggered by the presence of odors. So if you can get rid of the odors within water, that can be really helpful. I was looking online the other day, and you can buy, you can simply leave water in a jug and some of those odors will disappear just over time. You can buy a charcoal water filter quite cheaply just for your drinking water. I noticed some people are finding showering difficult because the smell of the water in the shower can be overwhelming. You can actually buy attachments for your shower to filter the water as well. You can, and if you want to spend lots of money, you can buy one for the whole house. But there are lots of options around water that could make that easier for those people who are suffering.
Good, right, thank you. So let's move on to the next. Let's start talking about foods, you know, actual food strategies.
Yeah.
I know you've got a couple there on your list, Duika. So why don't we talk about that?
Yeah, okay. Well, we've talked a bit about compensating using the sensory star and the taste star. So if you're finding that you're missing one element of flavor perception, you've got the other ones to work with that you can really ramp up. The other strategy that I think might be helpful is to have a bland strategy and a bold strategy. So have some bland foods. This is particularly for parosmia, I think. Having some bland foods that you can cope with, that have low odor release, if you like. So things like tofu, vegetables, mushrooms seem to be pretty universally acceptable. Some fruits, and I'm interested in the fruits, Chrissy, because I've heard some people suggest that tropical fruits are more difficult than, say, berry fruits.
Interesting.
Yeah.
I hadn't thought about that, but that's certainly a possibility.
Yeah.
And I also think it's worth saying, I mean, for instance, applesauce is a much more bland experience than, say, eating a raw apple.
Mm-hmm.
So, you know, it might be worth experimenting. And in fact, in all, you know, as you develop a new relationship with food, we can't emphasize enough how important it is for you to experiment. Yeah. And, you know, try out, Duika, you were saying one food, 5 ways. You know, you might find that food is palatable to you in one form that's not palatable in another. Specifically, let's take the case of the potato.
Yeah.
You might find that you can eat mashed potato or boiled potatoes, but potatoes that have been in any way browned, so fried or sauteed in a pan, deep fried, roasted, those things will tend to give you, will be parosmic triggers. Mm-hmm. But things that have been steamed or boiled or are not brown in any way seem to be just a little bit you know, easier to accept. So do try that. So potatoes, I think, are a good example for bland.
And the other thing about potatoes is if you think about temperature as well. I know a cold potato doesn't sound particularly appetizing if you're expecting it to be a warm potato, but actually a cold jacket potato can have lots of different textures within it, and if it's cold, it's not going to release quite so much aroma. And some people have said that that's easier to eat if you have parosmia.
I think frozen food as well, Duika, like releases fewer, you know, smell molecules. And so, you know, like I was saying, some people have frozen vegetables, like eaten actually still frozen, or frozen fruit. They really enjoy that, you know, because foods that are frozen tend to have a much lower sense of smell. Or even cold food like cereal, for example, maybe not frozen, but still cold, as opposed to maybe a cooked meal. Obviously, cold food would have a much lower sense of smell.
Yeah.
Yep.
And of course also kind of room temperature salads. You know, every salad doesn't have to consist of just lettuce, but you know, there are other things that go into salads. Lentils, that's a very you know, rich source of nutrients and calories and everything, which is wonderful in a salad with tomatoes, or you know, goat cheese, or whatever it is that you like. But salads can be also hearty and rich as well.
You could add things like couscous or quinoa or nuts, you know, depending on what people are able to tolerate.
The other thing about experimentation, when you think about, I love reading books about what some of these the super chefs are doing. So Grant Achatz, who has a restaurant in Chicago called Alineo, who's, you know, one of the most expensive restaurants in the world that you can go to. With his salad, he actually makes the salad with the balsamic dressing and freezes the whole thing, and then scrapes the ice into a bowl. And so it's like a frozen salad in a bowl, and it can be a really nice palate cleanser, but also quite exciting even for the non-parosmics and normosmics in your family to experience what a salad might taste like if you freeze it. So that's the kind of level of experimentation you can get to if you feel brave enough.
Exactly. We've got Marie has just commented that she can eat bread, but she can't eat toast. And I absolutely get what you mean, Marie, because you know, as soon as things start getting browned, they take on a new it's a new taste altogether.
Yeah.
And right, okay. I'm interested to know if you can enjoy food now as you did before you experienced parosmia, or do you have certain foods that you can't tolerate now due to having had a negative experience with it in the past? As some of you may know, I was, well, it's been 8 years since my original smell loss. I was quite well recovered, certainly had a very good quality of life, enjoyed my food, have had a certain level of parosmia occasionally. And then I also got COVID-19 and lost my sense of smell for a short period. And then a couple of weeks ago, I started to get parosmia again. So I recognized it when it came, and I'm adapting the way I always had. So for me, the parosmia phase originally lasted pretty much 2 years. And during that time, I got to learn which foods I could work with and which foods I couldn't, and just found my way back to include all these things that I think are so important for giving you back your quality of life. To anyone who is watching this and thinking, you know, it will never happen for me, I think you need to give it time. And so many people want to know, when am I going to get my sense of smell back so that it's 100%? But I think that, you know, you've had damage to your olfactory nerves probably. And that is an injury rather than an illness that might resolve like a cold. This damage will resolve eventually, but you might not be exactly the way you were before. And I think that's an important thing that people have to get to grips with. I know it's not easy, and I know that's not what you might want to hear right now, but what I do feel sure about saying is that in time, you'll feel better. And I think that's, you've got to focus on that and use as much of the things that we're talking about here to help you.
I mean, that was one of the key finding of Helen Carter's research in people with altered eating and Sjogren's syndrome, is that there was a purely durational effect, i.e. people who had been in the game a bit longer were generally doing better. They had got over the shock, they had started to experiment, they'd taken ownership of the condition. And so there's something about, like you said, Chrissy, it does change over time. So giving it time. It may not get back to normal, but you'll be able to get used to the new normal.
Yeah.
That much overused phrase.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Right. Just going back to some more questions. Sina says, since I can't taste anything, I mean anything, I can't even distinguish between salty, sweet, savory, etc. It's all about texture and consistency for me. I can't tolerate anything mushy or soft. Have you found that a lot in your work, Sheri, with head injury people?
Yeah, definitely texture is one of our main compensation strategies that we'll use if people have a diminished sense of taste and or smell. So I agree. I haven't come across anyone that can't tolerate mushy or soft, but that I totally understand why that might be possible. So it's just about being your own food detective and finding out what works for you, really.
There's also a lot to texture. I think we're very limited in the West in how we think about texture, but if you eat a Chinese diet, they're much more aware of different textural properties of food. So I love the fact that there are thousands of more words for texture in the Chinese language than there are in English. So one of the great stories that I love is the one about chicken's feet. I mean, if anybody's ever been to a Chinese restaurant and they serve chicken's feet, you think, why in the world do you want to eat that? It's just this bony, gelatinous, kind of tasteless, weird thing. But actually, in Chinese cuisine, it's considered the height of gastronomic wonderfulness because it's got crunchy, a little bit slimy, great sound, all sorts of things going on. So one of the things that can be interesting to explore is to expand your textural repertoire, if you like. Learn some more words for textures. My favorite one in Chinese is da nan, which is bouncing teeth texture. So when you eat pasta and your teeth bounce off of it, this is called da nan. So they actually have a word for that in Chinese. So there are opportunities to explore texture and become really interested and curious about it that may be helpful.
Right. And we've got another comment here on the subject of texture. I was relying a lot on texture, but since developing parosmia, I've struggled a lot with nausea and heartburn, both of which are putting me off my food even more. Any advice on how to navigate this? So I think, MCJ, I think what you might be saying is that after you lost your sense of smell and you were recovering from that, and before you started having parosmia, you were focusing on texture. I hope I have that right. And now you're feeling a lot of nausea. Heartburn with that, I don't know. I don't know what to say about that. I'm not sure, but how to navigate? Well, I think you need to be brave about exploring foods, even the foods that maybe you weren't so keen on before, and you just have to keep going until you find things that work for you. I think that was what we were talking about in the beginning, about this idea of being a detective, a taste detective, being open to trying out new things. And of course, doing that with a helper is useful. Vincent?
I was just going to say, I don't know if the person who asked that question is a post-COVID person, but gastric reflux seems to be an issue with some of the long COVID sufferers. And it's not my specialism, but I work with ENT people for a while and speech and language therapists. So just thinking about stuff like quantity of food, little and often it is better than large quantities at the same time. Just noticing stuff that triggers it and stuff that doesn't. And I know it seems to be our stock answer, but it is that experimenting that Chrissy was just talking about, but certainly little and often. And looking at the timing, looking at not eating too close to going to be horizontal, so don't eat too late at night.
And other triggers would be things like caffeine or alcohol can sometimes make the heartburn worse, for example. Most people know if there's particular foods that trigger it off. And I guess the other thing to consider is whether do you need some medication kind of on a short-term basis to help manage either of those conditions that perhaps your GP could help you with.
Yeah.
Can I pick up on a comment that Helen Cartner has made on the chat? Because Helen is the PhD student that I've mentioned a couple of times, who's doing the Sjogren's research, and
Right.
I think she's made a really crucial point that one of the unexpected findings of the head and neck cancer work that Duika and I have done, and Helen's work, and the work that Mia did in weight cycling, is once you get a group of people together who share a disorder, that they did most of the work for us. They were the experts. So they started sharing tips, and it was really oddly micro stuff. So have you tried the beans from Aldi? They're better than the beans from Tesco if you're sensitive to this. You know, they had just this wealth of knowledge. So what I would really encourage people to do is what Helen is suggesting, is try and come together and share tips, share what's worked with you. It might not work for someone else, but it'll probably work for someone.
Right, right. And for all of you who have been asking this evening about parosmia and phantosmia and, you know, things like why do I have it? How long is it going to last? All that kind of thing. There will be other webinars to discuss that, but we want to sort of try and focus on food today. And then maybe another time, as Vincent has just suggested, we can do something that's a bit more interactive, where we open up a Zoom where everybody can participate and speak, and that we can go around swapping ideas. We could have themes, and we could you know, hear what you have to say about the hacks that you've discovered that work for you.
Nice idea.
That's it. Yeah, that would be good. Right. What about Duika? Looking at your list there, you have something up there about techniques. That was just a sort of bit of basic, let's call it maintenance, to keep you healthy, keep you you know, keep your nose and your everything, all your sort of self-care regimes working well.
And I think, you know, I can't recommend highly enough using the absent resources on the Nosewell site for this, but particularly think about smell training. There's so much research around it, and it's so valuable. And Chrissy, you're probably way more expert to talk about nasal rinsing and mouth cleaning, but I think these can be really helpful as well.
We have so many people in the group talking about this very unpleasant taste they have in their mouth. And we know that people are sensitive to certain kinds of compounds, and these may be the kind of compounds that are building up, let's say, in between your teeth or below the gum line, things like that. So it's very important that you have really good dental hygiene, and that you maybe rinse your mouth out a couple of times a day with some sort of gentle mouthwash. If your mouth is feeling really sensitive and sore, there are some, if you've got burning mouth, for instance, there are some really good mouth rinses for sensitive mouths, and for, let's say, the same kind of rinses that you would use if you had a dry mouth problem. And these are really soothing. Sometimes they're sort of slightly viscous. And the ones that I've used, and I was actually sent a sample by another one, which is a dry mouth spray, very, very subtle flavoring, if at all. So you might want to try that. The other thing that I think is really soothing and really good is just a glass of room temperature water with a teaspoon of bicarbonate of soda in it. Stir that up, rinse that out. That kind of neutralizes a lot of these kind of breath smells. And you might find that you are not then responding to the smell of your own breath and the taste of your own mouth. So you might want to give those tips a try.
Mm-hmm.
I think what I'd like to do now is because believe it or not, we're actually galloping to the end of the hour, is I'd like to share the poll results.
Mm-hmm.
And so you can all see that. A lot of people here with parosmia, and of course that was a multiple choice question, so some people have parosmia and anosmia. But of the people, we've got 27% of us are not really affected tonight, so that's interesting to know. Yeah. 15% find tap water disgusting, so you will be very sensitive to some odor compounds in the water that maybe normal people are not. 62% of you are finding it difficult to get to grips with foods that you can eat, so that's not surprising here. And I just want to say again, I really believe it's going to get better for you. You've just got to hang in there. Not too many people have difficulty swallowing. That's good to know. And 46% of you have been so disgusted by food that you felt nauseous or you have been sick.
Yeah.
So gosh, that is a real...
That's quite a lot, isn't it?
That's a lot.
There is one thing that we haven't talked about, and that is, you know, if you feel like you just can't get the food down, and I've seen a lot of people posting on the Facebook sites that it becomes so difficult to eat that they just can't do it and feel nutritionally compromised and just feel overwhelmed by the whole eating problem. And I've noticed a lot of people have been looking at meal replacements as an option. So quite a few people have mentioned Huel, which is relatively easy to get. It seems like a good option. It's pea protein, oats, lots of, it's kind of astronaut food,
Right.
helps save the planet, that kind of thing.
By the way, other food replacement drinks are available, but Huel is a brand that we've heard discussed quite a bit in the parosmia group.
Yeah.
I have had drinks like that in the past. I think they definitely have a place for people who just can't eat because they are extremely bland, and you can just have them bland, hold your nose, and get something down your gullet, which is what you really need to keep up your strength and keep going.
Yeah, the other thing that we had, one of our cancer survivors used to complain a lot about the meal replacement type drinks. She hated them because they were all strawberry, banana and raspberry flavour, and it was very difficult to get a plain one, which is one of the reasons I mentioned Huel, not least because it's on the website, but because people are mentioning it. But the other thing that you can do with some of these meal replacements, potentially, I've tried making ice creams out of them, which work quite well, like freezing them so that the coolness of them makes them a bit more pleasant, and adding it to bread. I made a fabulous loaf of bread with the other day, and the texture was awesome. So so there may be other ways that you can add them to your bland repertoire when you're just feeling like you can't cope with the whole experimenting business. And I think that was another thing that we talked about a lot, Vincent, wasn't it? It was about kindness and having days off. You know,
I was just going to say that, you know, the way we've described it tonight, it's a journey, it's a struggle, it's an experiment, it's work basically, and give yourself some days off. Having a condition like this, it is a job of work. Give yourself breaks, have some days when you just don't focus on it, rest and recover. It's really important to your well-being.
That's so true. Believe it or not, we're almost at the end. So I just wanted to say before I start signing off that in 2 weeks, I will be here with Anne-Sophie Barwich, who is from the University of Indiana, and she'll be talking about her book, Smellosophy, which is highly acclaimed. and a very interesting book all about olfaction. So yeah, you might want to tune in for that. She's a very engaging person with an award-winning sense of humor as well. And so before we leave you tonight, I would like to say thank you very much to Sheri for joining us tonight. It's nice to have met you.
Yes,
Hope to see you again. Vincent, thank you very much for your contribution. It was lovely to see you too. And Duika, thank you too. It's been lovely to see you. Do join us again. As you know, absent.org is where the website is. We have 3 Facebook groups. Please join them if you have come to us tonight from Twitter. And yeah, so we'll just see you another time. Thank you very much for attending. Good
Thanks,
night.
everybody. Good night. Bye.